strategic understanding will play a great role in how we view a number of things that are with us right today. And not that we as individuals have any particular influence on making decisions. It still is incumbent upon us as members of this society to at least think about what our leaders are doing, how they're going about making decisions, and to listen with an open mind to some of the criticisms or some of the accolades that are offered. Because as individuals, and some of you, I believe, have been in the military, something I have not done, but in terms of your experiences, can appreciate more deeply what it means to the individual when these decisions are made. One of the things that constantly strikes me is how willing, or under different circumstances, how individuals were forced, quite literally, to sacrifice themselves, to end their lives in a particular situation. When our natural condition, our physiologic condition, is to do what we can to preserve our lives. To me, it's a constant, not surprise so much, but a constant thrust to watch a show of any sort. And in it, see somebody get killed. I'm just thinking last night, and I'll start the lecture shortly, but thinking last night, I was watching a show, and there are 10 bad guys chasing down 2 good guys, and they all get killed. And the people who sent those 10 guys are now kind of contemplating the effect. And we, in our real lives, would say, well, they got to have 10 bodies somewhere, and eventually somebody's going to miss them. And the guys who killed them, say, when one guy asked the other, what do we do about the bodies? He said, don't worry about it, nature will take care of it. And on the other side, the guys who sent them says, they won't be missed. Now, as a viewer, I thought of both aspects to it. And I thought, yeah, these 2 guys were going to get killed by these 10 guys. So in a sense, they have a right to defend themselves, if you will. But at the same time, there was absolutely no humanity with this at all. These were just cardboard characters who were dying on a screen. But that isn't the case here. These are real people with family connections, futures, past histories that put them where they are. And that's not to be weeping over the whole thing, but at least it is to bring to mind that when I throw out a number, as I have on a number of occasions of, 600,000 Russians getting caught in a trap and eventually dying, pretty much every one of them, to say that's a number. But as Stalin said, one man's death is a tragedy, and that of a million a statistic. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around it. But every now and then, I think it is worth stepping back from these numbers, from these maps, from even the photographs sometimes, and trying to put ourselves in the place of one of those anonymous figures in a photograph. And some of you have been there. And think to yourself, that's me. I'm walking behind that tank, or I'm plodding through that snow, or I'm crouched in a building somewhere. And that is my life on the line. So I hope that beyond the events that I described, we'll never completely give up on understanding the reality to every single human being who is involved here. Yes,
You say 600,000. I say everybody in Broome County 3 times.
and
That's how I think.
right.
Yeah.
Let's turn these front lights off so that the screen will show a little better. I do have a pointer, and Tom is going to use the cursor for those of you out in Zoom land to be able to see what is not otherwise showing when I use the cursor here. But let's start. I'm going to do a very quick review of where we were last time, and I'm going to put some context into this as well so that you'll have just in the back of your mind, not in the front of your mind, some of the events that are occurring elsewhere in the world during this time frame. So we talked last time about Timoshenko's offensive around Kharkov, the German counter thrust that took place, the destruction of the Russian armies that got caught and cut off in that particular event, followed by the onset of Operation Blue, the German plan to attack, which I broke down into 4 phases in Ukraine, with the targets of reaching the Volga River at Stalingrad and getting down into the Caucasus region, hopefully to capture the oil fields and sustain the German economy and military. I talked about the conquest of Sevastopol in the Crimea. I talked a bit about the counteroffensive that Russians had launched in the January, February time. We take the Crimea, how that failed, and eventually they were pushed out. And here, just as an example of numbers, to talk about what was involved at Sevastopol, and then as we scroll down quickly, what the losses were, and you see that the numbers are rather extraordinary. Here, individuals, lives, families, agendas of one sort or another. Then I talked about the first couple stages of the attack that the Germans launched in the south, and you'll see it down here. This is Operation Blue. And the first couple stages that were involved, first, clearing the area around Voronezh in order to get to the Don River and use that as a flank protection, and then drive to the southeast, eventually trying to reach the Volga River. This was Blau 1, Blau 2, and Blau 3. The idea here, as I mentioned, that the German directive from Hitler, and even expressed and understood by his generals at the time, was Stalingrad was not the target. The Volga was the target, with the intent of cutting off river traffic and any traffic on the west side of the Volga, which would supply the Russian armies. The intent was to capture Stalingrad if it was going to be easy. And what we will see as we get into this lecture more today is the distortion that occurred among the principal actors. In this case, Hitler versus Stalin, and how that changed and the effects that it caused as a result. The operation to encircle and cut off Stalingrad, you see here, with the various initiatives to attack from the north and from the south. This particular attack that you see in the blue arrows here was a result of a diversion of a Panzer Army 4 to the south to assist in the drive to the Caucasus. And when it became evident that that maneuver was not going to help the drive to the Caucasus, these units were turned around and brought back from the south. Panzer Group 4 initially started to the north of the Fifth Army, which is now here, Sixth Army. And they had switched positions. This line you see right here represents the division line between armies. This was just to give you an idea of the scope that's involved. This is only a small issue. But again, what I want to point out to each of us is insert yourself into the picture, not necessarily this guy. Suppose you're this guy, or you're this guy down here. You'll notice that there isn't a lot of mechanization in this particular picture, and indeed, even at this stage of the war, mid-42, German transportation relied heavily upon horses. Army Group South, under von Bock at this time, had been split into two groups, Army Group A and B. Now, for a long time, I always thought A was on the north and B was on the south. It's quite the reverse. Army Group A is on the south. Army Group B is on the north. Army Group B is going to Stalingrad. Army Group A is headed to the Caucasus. And in particular, as I talked about last time, taking the oil fields down here and eventually driving to the far south to Baku, which represented sort of the premier area for the capturing oil fields, was only going to be helpful to the Germans in terms of capturing oil fields if they could get the oil to the Black Sea and transport it by sea. Unfortunately for them, the Russians held on to this entire east coast of the Black Sea. And that really prohibited the Germans, even when they took a big oil field here at Maikop and drove down to some others down further south, they were unable to make use of the sea for transportation. So not only were the oil fields destroyed and had to be rebuilt, but the rail communications had been disrupted by the Russians in their retreat and had to be rebuilt as well. And using trucks was completely inefficient. This kind of situation, we'll also understand, establishes a very long open flank. Here's the Volga River, way over here, but it leaves a wide open flank to the east. And this becomes a dangerous element for Army Group B. Some of the fighting that occurs, Russian soldiers with a heavy machine gun, notice the wheels and so on. These guys are suffering under a very acute attack, but hope to repel. This is just simply a matter of describing for Army Group A some of the conditions under which they were advancing. As you got into the mountains, especially the high mountains, you can encounter frost and snow, right? And I have to tell you, just as an example, I've been out in mountains 7,000–8,000 feet in August and had snow. So it's an unpleasant experience if you're not prepared for it. But notice that in the flatter part, the temperature could reach up to 100+ degrees. So you're marching across the steppes, it's relatively dry. You've got that kind of heat beating down on you, and I just don't tolerate heat much above 90 degrees if I'm carrying a pack. Believe me, my legs are really feeling it. But during the course of this advance, even though the Russians had learned the lesson of not trying to stand fast and resist every forward movement, even though they were retreating back, willing to trade literally ground for time and to preserve their military, they still lost a considerable amount of material and men. One of the things that is important to keep in mind through this, therefore, is that while the Germans appear to have a preponderance of force, as you'll see with all those blue icons, those are not completely intact units either. Those divisions are weakening almost day by day. Why? Because the supply lines are getting increasingly long. Reinforcements are hard to come by. Remember that at the end of the Russian counteroffensives in 41, the Germans were short over 250,000 replacements. And the main reason they were able to build their numbers back up to nearly 3 million on the entire Eastern Front was because they brought in Italians and Romanians and Hungarians. The number of Germans available is diminishing as losses are rampant through the Eastern Front. On the other hand, the Russians, despite enormous losses, are still able to bring in sufficient numbers, admittedly ill-trained and often ill-equipped, in order to try to stem the German tide. Because of the slowness of the advance that was occurring in both directions for a variety of reasons, Hitler became very unhappy with his senior generals. And as a result, he removed von Bock and he took Army Group A and B, split them into different commanders, and put them under a unified command, but a person whom he was going to watch very carefully and who was going to be very much in line with his strategic vision. In addition, one of his main chiefs of staff, one of his main military advisors, Halder, is removed as well. Now, Halder had been a critic of much of the Eastern Front campaign, but I will warn you, if you read personal histories from German generals at the time, please read it carefully, because there's a lot of CYA in there. And one in particular, I'm just going to mention, not that I expect anyone to go out and buy it, but by General Warleman, who wrote a very comprehensive history called Inside Hitler's Command Structure. I think that's the name of it, or something like that. And as you read through it, his condemnation of Hitler is almost pervasive on every page. And one has to be a little bit careful in saying that Warleman, because he's in the command structure, is giving you the real skinny. It's a very interesting set of biases that show up repeatedly through it. And I talked a little bit about this issue related to strategic decisions, because I think it's critical not only to understand how these people got where they are and how circumstances arose that brought them into conflict where they are, but more particularly to understand that independent of the emotions and judgments we attach to people like Hitler and Stalin, in my view, well deserved, but at the same time, the enormous responsibility and burdens they carry. And the depth to which they believed in their ideological goals, which is what drove this Eastern Front almost from the beginning through the very end. If we don't keep those in mind, we won't understand what was happening. This just gives you another idea and reinforces what I've talked about with horses, and they might just look at these bodies, but they've been seeing them for weeks and weeks and weeks. So they're just ignored, the commonality of it. As the Germans moved across Ukraine through the summer, because they began their offensive in June, and they reached the outskirts of Stalingrad at the beginning of September, very end of August, I just want to take a moment and remind everyone what else was going on. In a previous lecture, I talked briefly about April of 42, when the Doolittle raid was launched against Tokyo. May, the Coral Sea. June, Midway. August of 42, shortly before this date, August 7, the U.S. invades Guadalcanal, Malagi and Capucho. We talked about that, spent a whole 2 hours on Guadalcanal. In North Africa, Rommel has begun his offensive and drive from where he had been driven back all across Libya, and he's on his way eventually to Egypt. In the Atlantic, the German submarines, even operating at reduced efficiency due to a lack of fuel, are having a great time, sometimes called the second happy time, sinking American and British merchant ships in the Atlantic and off the coast of the United States. Yes,
Wasn't Alamein in 1941?
no,
It was 42.
42 October.
Okay, thank you.
The
I
issues
stand
that
corrected.
we're looking at, therefore, are complex around the world. Russia is being thrown back, and we've talked a lot about that. But at the same time, I want you to just keep in mind the sort of global perspective of what else is happening and how this affects decisions that are being made at various levels. I did talk about in terms of the Battle of the Atlantic, just to give you another snippet of information, that Britain was supplying, as was the United States through Lend-Lease, many pieces of equipment to Russia, including a commitment to provide up to 10,000 trucks a month. The only way you get them there is to ship them over there. But with the destruction of convoy PQ-17, for example, where 22 out of 35 merchant ships were sunk, Churchill stopped sending things over the North Sea, the northern coast, and we still had to rely on a very long supply line up through Iran in order to get supplies up to Russia. Because obviously we're not going to land them in Vladivostok with the Japanese controlling that part of the Pacific. So keep those things in mind. Supplies from the Russian standpoint are beginning to be cut off. And this is going to make their situation very difficult because despite what they've done in moving factories out of the way in 41 and moving them to the Urals, they're in the process of reestablishing those factories, getting them up and running, sometimes under the most primitive conditions, in order to keep arms and armament moving to the front. But the lack of mobility is a key factor. And as we'll see later on in other lectures, as we move through the war, it was the trucks that the British and Americans sent to Russia that had a profound impact on improving Russian mobility. At this time of the war, the number of vehicles that are present in the German army and the Russian army is rather small in comparison to what was true for the American and British armies. Much heavier reliant upon vehicles, which meant you're also heavily reliant on what's called POL, petroleum oil lubricants, to keep those things running. All right. At the end of August, the Germans drive back the two main Russian armies that are opposing them, the 62nd and the 64th. And as they reach the outskirts of Stalingrad, as you'll see here, you'll see that the city is stretched out along the Volga River, but is quite narrow, and especially narrow here. What does this mean in terms of defense? You have nowhere to go. The Volga's at your back. So if you're going to keep the city, you really have to stay and, if necessary, die in place. Now, if you're an individual soldier, you're going to ask yourself, who cares? I mean, so what if we give up Stalingrad? Why does this place figures so importantly? What was the critical set of elements that required me to defend this building or this house or this trench at the cost of my life? When safety lies maybe just a few hundred meters back to where I can get a ferry or a raft and get to safety. Because once I'm over here, the Germans aren't going to be able to cross the river. That we can be pretty sure. Similarly, if you're going to make the argument to me as an individual soldier that, well, we're protecting the Volga River from being interdicted by the Germans, my response is the Germans reach the Volga here and they reach the Volga there. What's the difference by holding the city? So as an individual, even a commander of a company or a battalion or a regiment or even a division, or in the case of Chulkov and Shumilov, who were both commanding 62nd and 64th armies, why should I die here? What's the purpose of sacrificing my army in this place when tactically there might be some good fighting to be done, but at the same time, strategically, the Volga is still cut. And that was, after all, the strategic goal Hitler had outlined in his first directive relating to this, Directive 45. So we look at this situation and we have to ask ourselves those questions. Because that moves the decision process further up the scale. Why then did Stalin want to hold on to this city? And why did Hitler put so much effort into trying to capture it? And how was that conducted? And what were the implications of those decisions? Is that part pretty clear at this point? I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time discussing the actual fighting in Stalingrad, though I'm going to walk through the major phases. But if we do not understand why they even fought here, then we can't understand what happened. What were the implications later on? How does this relate to anything today? Because if you're paying attention to what's going on in what's called the special military operation in Ukraine, that's what the Russians call it. We call it the Russo-Ukrainian War, even though they haven't declared war formally on each other. The fighting around Bakhmut, Andreyevka, the fighting that was occurring near Kiev early on, the fighting that was occurring near Kharkov. Why did those things happen where they did? And why are the outcomes showing us the result of various decisions that are being made? And what is the overall implication? Especially because we, as the United States and the West in general, are so deeply involved in supporting Ukraine. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that without a strategic view, we're going to lose perspective on what's going on. We're simply going to listen to a pundit talk about something. Okay. So, first issue, why does Stalin want to defend this? He has seen, from the descriptions I gave in the last lecture, this convoluted Eastern front line. And initially, his perspective was, I must defend Moscow. The Germans will try to attack Moscow because that is the single most important strategic goal the Germans could have, and they're within 100 miles. So I'm going to put most of my strength around Moscow. And I'll resist the German drive, and I'll try to build up reserves so that as in 41, I can launch a counteroffensive and destroy them. And then there's some other opportunities that may be available, and that was why Timoshenko attacked around Kharkov. An opportunity that turned out not to turn out well for him, but there you go. Now what he's seeing is the collapse of the Southern Front. And as the Germans drive towards Stalingrad, they continue to use the Don River as their northern flank. That means that the river and the units there are stretching out until the vanguard of the Sixth Army crosses the Don River to try to reach the Volga. There's a land gap of about 50 miles between the end of the Don and a town of Kalach, if I pronounce it correctly. Don't get the gutturals quite right all the time. To Stalingrad, a relatively short distance, given the literal hundreds of miles of flank that's exposed from Bordyansk all the way down to Stalingrad. Stalin, during the Russian Civil War, had defended a town named Tsaritsyn, or the Tsar's city. And he fought a very intense battle there and largely turned back the assault that was coming towards that city from the south and southwest by the so-called White Russians, if you will. I think it was Denikin's army, though I may have forgotten. But he was successful there. And when he became the supreme leader, they changed the name of the city from Tsaritsyn to Stalingrad, Stalin's city. So he had a historical and an emotional reaction to it. This city is my city. But it was much more than that as well, because Stalin was learning an important lesson, which Hitler was not. And that was, emotion can help you up to a certain point, but ultimately it's likely to lead you astray because you're going to begin to ignore certain conditions which will cause an ultimate failure of that particular reaction and lead to disaster. His senior generals at the time began to understand that this long flank along the Don River offered opportunities. But as the Russians are falling back in the Caucasus, as they're falling back towards Stalingrad, things are looking pretty dicey. So what's the decision going to be? It's going to shift reserves from around Moscow because he now recognizes the Germans are incapable of launching a broad front assault. So it means he can take reserves from around Moscow and he can move them south. And when he moves them south, he can bolster two things: the defense of his city, to which he has a strong emotional component, but he can also bolster units on the flanks. And indeed, through part of August and even into September, there are attacks against that northern flank, particularly in the land bridge between Kalach and Stalingrad. And while these caused the Germans to divert resources from the continued advance into Stalingrad, to bolster and stop those attacks against the northern flank particularly, and cause considerable destruction to the attackers, it does weaken their ability to penetrate the city. But now there's another subtle effect that enters into this. With the understanding and support of the senior generals, Zhukov gets a lot of the credit for this. But Yeremenko, Shaposhnikov, even Timoshenko, who had suffered badly and was relegated to a somewhat lower front command position for a time, were all indicating to Stalin that if he held Stalingrad, it wasn't that it was a bridgehead from which an attack could be launched to eventually destroy the German army, but rather it would suck up resources. And as the Germans committed more and more to try to take Stalingrad, it meant that the Germans were more heavily reliant on their Axis partners, particularly the Romanians, which were on the either side of the flank particularly, who were noticeably weaker than standard German units. So numbers alone didn't matter. What mattered was your equipment and training. And the Romanians were nowhere near as good at it as were the Germans. That meant that if the Russians built up sufficient resources, they could attack the Romanians. And they could possibly penetrate through and cut off the German units that would be in Stalingrad. This takes an enormous act of will. Because what it means from Stalin's level is the city, which eventually will be almost 90+% occupied by the Germans, as we'll see in a minute, has to be held to keep the Germans committed, to keep sucking up resources, while they build up for this enormous counteroffensive that they hope to conduct. He's got to have people in charge who absolutely will not quit. Now, as you'll see here, they send down General Yermolenko in order to command initially one of the fronts, but eventually it becomes clear that Yermolenko has to move to a higher level of command and control several fronts altogether. As a result, Chulkov, who was a deputy to the staff of 64th Army under Shumilov, is moved to replace the current commander of 62nd Army, a guy named Patton, who was getting increasingly pessimistic about his chances of holding on. And Chulkov is given command. Chulkov's headquarters is in Stalingrad, right? And initially he's here at a prominent hill, which is going to be a target for the Germans, because if you take that hill, you're high enough that you can actually see much of Stalingrad. And he's going to attack that area, and he's going to drive Chulkov out. Chulkov eventually finds himself literally within 100 yards of the Volga. And even there, he's almost killed as a result of various attacks. But one thing you can say about Chulkov, the man was absolutely fearless. And it's extraordinary to read about these people and what they accomplished. Now, maps look as though everything is flat. Yes.
A quick one, Shulikov, I'm not sure I pronounced it right. Was he aware of Stalin's strategy, or was he?
Indirectly, I mean, Stalin basically said, you will not leave Stalingrad.
Well, that's saying that's one thing, but knowing why.
Oh, no, he's not gonna tell him, the whole grand strategy. Your job as an army commander is to do what I tell you, okay? And I'll send you reinforcements, and you're to take care of the logistical issues, and you're to tell your divisions that come in where to go, what terrain to hold, what to fight for.
So Stalin is keeping it close to the vest, so to speak.
And remember that Stalin was also absolutely paranoid that he had spies. Remember that in 37, he completely destroyed the Russian Army High Command, 37,000 officers. Got rid of them. That's how paranoid he was. But he was learning now that he had to trust his military advisors. And even then, it was still an uneven balance. He had his ideas, and he was going to execute them, just as Hitler was going to do that. Yes.
I'm trying to orient myself. Where's the Volga on that?
On this one, the Volga's down here, down at the bottom.
Okay, what are those other water features?
These are what are called Balkas. ravines. And these represent streams or rivers that, remember, as I talked about, because much of the steps were fairly flat, when it rained, water had to find someplace to go. Seeped into the groundwater and then quickly passed into these. And you'll see comparable things, say, in Africa, with what's called a wadi.
Mhm.
All right. Or if you go to the Grand Canyon, you'll see crevices leading down that are dry, but if you're caught there in a rainstorm, suddenly there are torrents of water coming down. So these represent the rough area. Now, this down here is what became known as the infamous tennis racket. You can see why. It was a railroad loop and encircled a great number of factories, which even at this time were churning out weapons of war, including tanks.
So the tractor factory was still in operation.
They fought almost literally to produce until the Germans finally took it. But the other reason I show this is that this isn't flat terrain. So moving cross country, in this case, because north is off the map in that direction because the Volga heads north, right? This kind of movement becomes very difficult, especially if any bridges that normally would allow you to cross are blown up, which of course they were. So not easy terrain, and it's something that the maps practically never can show. Now, in the outskirts of Stalingrad, while there were many hundreds of thousands of troops elsewhere, this just shows you, in a sense, what the balance of forces was as the German Sixth Army was penetrating the outskirts of Stalingrad. Notice that the number of aircraft was really the critical feature. And indeed, maybe a strategic or at least operational mistake made by the Germans was that they attacked the city of Stalingrad with bombers, not necessarily the defenders, the Russian army defenders, and turned the city into rubble. Now, historians have jumped on that action, and I think with some justification, to say that as a result, they merely created a situation where the terrain was even worse. Yeah, because you reduce mobility. With all that rubble in the streets, for example, you couldn't bring tanks through easily. And you have hiding places for snipers and bunkers and things of this sort. But you do also, by creating all that rubble, reduce the fields of fire. So instead of being able to look out this window, for example, and see 50 yards, I can see 20. Now, if I only can see 20 yards and there are guys on the other side of that, that's almost within grenade throwing distance, right? 50 yards, in spite of what George showed us as to how you could throw an overhand Russian grenade or a German potato masher. That's pretty close. So the idea was that rubble could work both ways. And it's important to keep that in mind because I've never been involved in urban fighting, but periodically, just in my own mind's eye, if I'm downtown or I'm walking down, someplace in another big city, and I look at this building of, say, 7 or 8 stories, and I think I've got a wide open street, and he's got a field of fire with a machine gun of 800 yards down that street. Man, that's a barrier. I don't think I want to try running across it.
So you've never done paintball?
No, I haven't. But the reason I mention this, and you wonder about it, in stuff that I've been learning about the fighting at Bakhmut in the Ukraine, as an example, one of the things one of the commentators talks about are these wide streets. You try to cross a wide street, it's going to take you a little while to run across there, and a guy hundreds of yards away can see you, then your chances of getting across are really not all that great. especially if there's more than one of you. Somebody's gonna get nailed. So again, the arguments can be on both sides. Now, this is a blow up, just to show that the Germans were going to commit more and more resources. As you'll see here, this over here, for example, is a armored corps, but armor has less effectiveness in city fighting. Can help you, but if you ever want to read reports, the one thing that armor cannot do is go into a city without strong infantry support, or they're going to get ambushed. And you want a good example of that, again, just for whatever it's worth, in Saving Private Ryan in the last scenes when they're in the city or town. And they occupy high ground, they channel the German army, then somebody can run out of the building and put a mine against the tank and disappear into the building and damage the tank, blow the treads off. Except one guy got himself blown up. Not a pretty sight. So here, what you'll see is the Germans are penetrating this up here, Mamea Kugan, which is actually a cemetery of sorts on a tall hill. And I believe now has the famous statue that the Russians put up after World War II to commemorate the Battle of Stalingrad. This is where Chuikov was headquartered, but he had to retreat back and find a dugout nearly on the Volga beach in order to continue command. And it looks as though with the penetration that not only have the Russians been forced back to a very small enclave in this particular part of the city, but the 64th Army is now separated from the 67th. They're no longer in connection on the west bank of the Volga. So the fighting in Stalingrad now will fall on Chuikov. This situation is a different kind of map, but I show this for a very particular reason. Like the terrain map that I showed you, you see here the Tsaritsa River, but you'll see these Balkans, these ravines that are present throughout this area, making it very difficult for you to cross this terrain without great superiority of firepower. And indeed, what you'll see is that the Russians here with the 42nd Rifle Brigade and the 6th Tank Brigade and so on are holding off the Germans while the Germans are penetrating here. And what this shows you is the rail line that's coming in through here, leads up to what's called the grain elevator, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But in terms of damage, the Russians are going to be forced back from this area and they're going to yield the southern part of Stalingrad to the Germans. I mentioned the grain elevator because when the Germans eventually penetrate to where that arrow is, they fight there for a week. Now, if you think that's bad, there's a place called Pavlov's house where they fought for 2 months. Wow. A house. So they kept feeding in, the Russians kept feeding in forces to hold on to little bits of terrain. Now, to even call it Pavlov's house may seem a little bit strange, but the point is when you actually see photographs of it, parts of it are still very much intact. And people can be on the second floor. So you had high ground. You could look further down the street. If you put a sniper up there, he could pick off guys trying to cross the street. You could see where they might be mustering forces in order to attack. And that would allow you to bolster them. But all in all, as we go through this entire time, the key element is that Chuikov was able to hold on almost literally by a thread. It gets that much tense. for him, and yet he will not give up. And he's told, you will not give up the city. These are categorical orders. You don't get to choose at this point. This literally is, you're gonna stay there or die. And if you die, I'll consider you a failure. House to house fighting literally occurred between different floors. There are stories how in the grain elevator, for example, the Germans penetrated it initially through the Russians out, the Russians counterattacked. They took the bottom floor, the Germans had the second floor. And they're throwing grenades down through holes in the floor, and they're shooting up staircases until eventually the Germans were eliminated. And then finally, after a week of fighting, the Germans were able to take the grain elevator. But this gives you an idea of what's going on, and well, that's you over there in the corner. At that point, you have a job. You're to kill all the Germans you can. And if you die in the process, that's just tough. We got somebody to replace you. Here, as September comes to a close, you'll notice now that the southern part of Stalingrad is under German control, except for a very small bridgehead left here, that frankly, in itself is of no consequence. Why hold it? Because you're going to pin down some German units that are trying to get you out of there. And if they drive you out, then they'll be useful somewhere else. The sacrifice that was being demanded of these people is extraordinary because, again, if you're an individual soldier, your first thought is, well, yeah, I'd like to kill Germans. I also want to survive. And I'm not doing this to shoot myself, right? So these kinds of missions have to breach a level of psychology and enforceable discipline. It turns out in some late reports that the NKVD, sort of the analogy would be the rock of the German Gestapo, may have killed as many as 50,000 Russians who were not quite up to the task. So again, when you think about what happened in Germany later in the war, where they were shooting Germans who were retreating from them, the Gestapo was doing that and other security units. That's happening here. You ain't leaving without my permission. And if you try, then I just get to shoot you. There's no trial, there is no court martial. I just shoot you. The Russians still are pouring in, but as a result of the consumption, the Germans are weakening. They're burning up equipment and men at a prodigious degree. And now we're beginning to reach towards one of the most critical sets of decisions that's going to be made. I want you to think hard about this for just a moment. We've already talked to a degree about why Stalin wanted to hold on to the city, both from a military and an emotional standpoint. Why did Hitler? He'd already cut the Volga. That was the initial strategic goal of Directive 45 and this whole attack through the Ukraine. Why? And this is one of the turning points, if you will, at least at a certain level, where Hitler now began to react emotionally. Analytically, he was still very sharp, but increasingly was not listening carefully and analyzing carefully the military situation. He was seeing the Sixth Army consumed in a battle for a city that was more now political than military, because it had Stalin's name attached to it. Would he have behaved the same way if this was still named Tsaritsyn, or as it is today, Volgograd? I don't know, and I don't pretend to know. But the point I'm trying to make is he allowed more and more resources to be fed into the city with weakening, lengthening flanks. And even though the Russians were very, very good at hiding their intentions, think back to December of 41, when they launched their counteroffensive, to a complete surprise to the Germans, truly. And he's ignoring that lesson from 41 in order to achieve an objective which inherently had no military significance. A bridgehead that the Russians held here and would muster forces to threaten a German defense line was almost inconsequential. You just couldn't get enough power there across the river. Whereas your supply lines leading to the northern bank of the Don River, which represents the left of this army, this whole army group, you've got great overland supply. So you don't have to cross a river like this, try to feed supplies, and if you're gonna bolster that army up enough to be an offensive threat. So Hitler's decision to hold his Sixth Army in place to try to take the rest of that city was driven not by his military, but driven by his emotion. The grain elevators you'll see here, Mamayev Kugan, they're going to take that away from, they're going to drive the Russians further back onto the border. And in the northern section of the city, they're going to make a great initiative to try to collapse this bulge and get to the Volga River here. They're already off map to the north on the river. But here they want to collapse this down. And Chuikov, again, is bolstering whatever resources he can in order to hold on. But even then, the Germans are powerful enough, the Russians weak enough, that they're being driven back. As we get into late October and November, the weather begins to deteriorate. The purpose of showing you this isn't so much this, as to show you what's happening out in the city and why having high ground, which is obvious from this photograph, is important. Now, this is likely a staged photograph, okay? Because the photographer clearly appears to be standing up and all of these guys are poised.
Well, they're all
You get out of there within a couple minutes, because you know that once you're spotted, mortars are going to start landing in your vicinity. But it's important to see that. Similarly, in the outskirts of the city, as they penetrate deeper and deeper in, you begin to run into this kind of stuff where trenches are dug. Notice that there's still buildings standing here. There are going to be people up here who will be looking down on you and looking out to find out where your reserves are. Where are people coming from? The northern part collapses. As you can see here, the Germans are going to reach the Volga there, and they're going to drive the remnants back into the northern enclave of the city. The Russians are still holding on here, but very, very tenuous. And if you look down here, you'll see the legend, right? And that is 1 mile. And so if you take this part, and this is October, you'll see that at most you maybe have 1 mile or 2 that you're from the river's edge. And after that, you got no place to go. This is again a blow up of the same area, just to kind of give you an idea. There's a ferry here, but this is really only about a half mile from the front line, which means, surprisingly, relatively small caliber guns can interdict you coming across the Volga. Much of the time, and you'll see photographs of this at different places, where the Russians are on boats or rafts or ferries coming across, and you see shells landing all around them. Some of the boats getting blown up and people in the water struggling not to drown, find some driftwood that they can hang on to. Okay. As the fighting continues, you see the deeper penetrations. They look like they've almost got it. And at this point, Hitler goes to the Reichstag and he talks about the fighting at Stalingrad. And he boasts about the success that the German forces have had. At the same time, he sort of mocks the decision almost unknowingly on himself, because he begins to talk about it in a political sense rather than a military sense. And indeed, one of the comments he makes is that he wanted to avoid another Verdun. You remember from World War I, the commitment of German and French resources around the city of Verdun that cost hundreds of thousands of casualties to take a city that militarily had relatively small importance, given the entire picture in World War I. And indeed, what did he do? He committed a sort of Verdun here in the South. So both sides fed in reinforcement after reinforcement after reinforcement. And as October begins to come to a close, it becomes very obvious that from the Russian standpoint, they are going to hold on. Because while this is happening, they're building up their resources on the flanks. They have made that plan very clear as to what they're going to do. And while casualties are heavy, they can keep feeding in just enough to hold on. And I like this photograph because it gives you a little sense of who the Russians are, what they endured, how they behave, because from our perspective, and I say this non-critically, but I think it's true, we tend to have a bit more connection to the Germans in some ways than we do for the Russians many times. And I have to admit, in many of the books that I've read, I find myself in this odd position of thinking, if you just did this, you could take the city. Oh, you're not going to get cut off, you can just do it. And then think, man, if they won this war, what a horrible situation that would have been. But at the same time, it's just one of these things that happens to us all. So you have some guy in a gray coat and a hat trying to stay warm around the fire, and they're gonna be hidden behind buildings because they don't want that light to show, just makes them a target than somebody who's across the street or a couple streets away. Now, I'm going to take a break in a moment because the next part of this lecture today, I'm going to leave you all a little hanging for, hopefully you'll come back in the fall. Hopefully I'll make it till then. Instead, what we're going to talk about in a fair amount of detail is something that is rarely talked about, even in most major histories. Now, Greg, I want you to point out, I think you brought Lance's book.
I did. I also bought When Titans Clash. It's David Glantz and Jonathan House with our BU connection again. This is all of World War II on the Eastern Front. Unlike the 5 volumes I had just on the Stalingrad campaign. That's it.
Right.
This is Zhukov's Greatest Defeat by David Glantz. And there were, I don't want to steal your thunder. This is another book about the offensive outside Moscow.
Right. All right. So questions, anybody at this point, and stretch your legs, bathroom breaks, the usual, take 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay.
For those of you who aren't here, you're missing these great maps. What is it? From that movie with
You're right there last time. You missed it all. No. I know. I was hoping nothing was wrong, but they figured you were visiting grandkids or something. Something. I missed Steve out on one key. What were you doing during the war?
Well, my father was in the combined chiefs of staff.
Yeah, I figured.
I remember D-Day as being shooed to bed. Finding out about it in the morning. It's kind of interesting.
It was, where was he located?
Washington, DC.
So he was in the army?
Oh, there's one.
Does he have any souvenirs like guns or no, he wouldn't have had any.
Yeah.
Well, he has a marvelous autobiography of all of what he did, what he was concerned with. It's very interesting. So I remember the war is who's coming to Sunday dinner. That was very interesting.
No.
French and
Telling you.
so on.
He had already assumed
British
that
were
that-
mostly on Sunday going up to see their families in Montreal.
So what was his rank?
He was a colonel in the army. Actually, a very fascinating time.
Well, looking back on
Yeah.
it, it's fascinating. I
Yeah.
think when you were in, it wasn't fascinating, it was
Yeah.
scary. Darn scary.
Saying my father was in the combined.
Judy McMahon.
Not today.
I remember.
I'll have to give her a call.
We've got set up.
and tell her what-
Probably.
There are a few fewer people here today.
French.
They're all groups that keepers. Oh,
Why?
well, because what's his face is being.
That doesn't happen till this afternoon.
Oh, it does, it doesn't. Oh, I thought it happened this morning. We gotta think about it, you know, I'm up to
Even
here
if they were subdued.
with all of it, you know.
And we would rather come here.
I see you're still on the University Women's Club Board, isn't that? I know, they were supposed to get me like an assistant, you know, who was gonna be co-chair and turn it over to her next time. I'll have to find out what happened to that. They had someone in mind. It's not a hard job, really. You just do it.
You have to just send out reminders.
Remind
Yes.
you and all that kind of stuff. You know, but their point is maybe, you know, these young girls that are in it now want maybe different things. And my point, you know, is, well, then, you know, let them organize it. I mean, we're open to all sorts of groups, but I'm not in that, you know what I mean? I can't do much. They gotta do it within
Oh,
themselves.
yes, they do. They have to have their own ideas and then push them.
Push them, so they're thinking that, you know, it's time to modernize, so, because we're into, like, they've talked a lot, we should have a hiking group on the weekend, well.
Okay, so have one.
But we, I do see one is except when the show, you know,
Yeah, but we are not going to switch your group to the weekend.
yeah,
No,
you know. they-
Absolutely
and there
not.
was some talking about ski group on the weekend, and they just couldn't carry it on, it's hard to. The people that are working, women
Yeah,
that are
they have
working,
to, of
they
course.
have to have.
and
their
that's why we're
weekends.
having all our meetings at a time which doesn't suit us at all, me at all.
Oh,
But I mean, 5:30 in the evening is, I eat at 5:45.
Right,
But this one, I'm just going to avoid eating. I'm just going to, to the 4:31, I'll keep it down.
yeah.
If I can figure out.
They
where
want
it
them
is.
to come, you know, not to go home, to go right to the meetings, which I can.
Yes, that's exactly. And it's a good idea.
In my
So,
car.
a whole
I have
different-
some copies
Yeah.
of,
But that's nice. At least it's going on.
Just this is going on.
I had
Cooking
this
looked
came
good.
from Freedom.
See, they did,
Really?
but not
they
the
got
big
somebody in the
not the
cooking,
little-
they made like ravioli, they made pasta and made ravioli.
Well, they're not doing that, and I went to a cooking school, one of our cooking schools. And I decided, nah, it's not worth it, but you probably do it all the time.
I did it once and it was like, I didn't realize you had to run it through 100 times, you know? It was the kid said it was a little chewy.
So
It wasn't, it was, you know, it was, and I know the thing had no instructions, so you know, you had to run that, you go through.
oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, a lot of times. So
I remember, I think Sally Bodine and I bought one of these little things, you put it
Yeah.
through, and then we said the hell with it.
And the directions are like, no directions, you know, it's not like step by step. So that was, you know, I tried a lot of. things.
Takes up a lot of people's time doing that too.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I'd like to be able to make things like ravioli. I really like ravioli.
Yeah.
But it's okay, buy it at Wegmans. It's okay.
Yeah,
It'll do.
it's so, doing that more and more. Not making my own.
So was George good last week?
Yes,
Yes.
had, the guns,
Oh, wow.
more guns.
Uh-huh.
What else did he? put?
Hand grenades.
Yeah, hand grenades. I wonder where people keep all this stuff, you know? You know, it's got it in helmets, and some helmets.
Because when he did the World War One thing, I don't know whether you were there.
Yes, I think so.
He had all kinds of the little things that you keep the ammunition in
Yeah,
and the belts
yeah.
and all that kind of stuff.
I explained how they put the one is repeating.
The stripper clips.
That they put in that they, when they D-Day, they all had these, they shot like 8 shots before they had to reload.
How are you?
Things
Good to
are-
see you. He's been stepping through the German.
He has an amazing collection. He really does. And he's got an amazing collection of other things like what he cooked with in in early America.
Right, and stuff, he had some stuff with,
yes.
Civil War. A lot of that.
Judy, see us before you leave. We'll figure out the time on Thursday.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
We,
all right, thanks, everybody, appreciate the time. What we're gonna do right now is we're gonna delve into something that is a little bit of a reprise of what I talked about at the end of the last lecture and the beginning of this one, that is the strategic view that had to be kept in mind and to what was going to happen. I had indicated particularly that Stalin had basically begun to learn that he had to trust his military analysts and could not let emotion rule the way it had, particularly in the first 8 or 16 months of the war. But he hadn't totally given it up. And he could always justify some of his emotional responses with some of his military considerations. So this particular map shows that the position of Moscow and the German line that you'll see that is still relatively close to it, and why he had the concerns that the Germans would launch an attack from that salient and try to take Moscow. You also see down below where Stalingrad is. So the division line is considerable. And you'll see, as I've talked about, this particular line of the Don River up the Voronezh here, that is the long northern flank of the German front, if you will, and how this might be vulnerable at some point. The Russians held some bridgeheads across the Don River, despite attempts, particularly by the Romanians and some German support, to reduce these bridgeheads. They were unable to do so. And in particular, one of the critical ones was fairly close into Stalingrad in that location there. At the same time, there were opportunities. While the Germans had cut off Leningrad way up here, there was still a narrow salient that could be pinched off and might allow overland supply to Leningrad to relieve the city. So action would take place up there, and when I finished last time talking about the reduction of the Crimea by Manstein and his 11th Army, Manstein and some of his units were shifted north in order to widen this and prevent Leningrad from being relieved. There turned out to be a Russian offensive up there which consumed some of the German resources. Yes.
Are Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad all on the Volga?
No. No, Leningrad is separate from the Volga. The Volga does come up fairly close, but still in terms of positioning. Leningrad is separate. Okay. Now, in analyzing this, you'll see that you can call this a German salient. You can call this a Russian salient, and then another German salient. All of these represent opportunities for both sides. When the decisions were being made to conduct an offensive around Stalingrad, having little opportunity to do anything offensively from a Russian standpoint because you had to divert resources all the way down here and therefore could not launch an offensive. The idea was still that once this had stabilized, it was possible to launch an offensive up here and reduce this 9th Army. This is actually with conjunction of a third Panzer Corps against Army Group Center. This also would take enormous planning and commitment of resources, but remember, the Russians had already been planning by consolidating reserves around Moscow to defend it and then possibly counterattack. So they're already kind of in preparation. Whereas to attack down here meant shifting a great many resources. But opportunities appear to abound. This is a little bit more to show you that the three major offenses that were going to occur struck these particular areas. And the one we're going to talk about in the beginning is not Operation Uranus. We're going to talk primarily about Operation Mars. Why? First, it's neglected in many histories written by both sides as to its significance and importance in the battle for the Eastern Front. Secondly, many historians accepted the Russian justification because it was launched somewhat after Operation Uranus. The idea was that it was to hold the Germans in place and prevent them from sending reserves to break Operation Uranus, to break the encirclement of Stalingrad. However, what is left out, and Lance's book in particular deals at great length with this, is that Operation Mars was to be followed by Operation Jupiter. And what was Jupiter to do? Jupiter was not just to base on the reduction of the salient. Here is Smolensk. Then you have Vitebsk, Veliki Luki, and other spots that meant if you were going to drive and take Smolensk, you cut off the single most important road along which supplies could come from Germany to the front line, the Army Group Center. So there was much more intended with Operation Mars because it was to be a follow-up attack, just as with Operation Uranus, it was to be followed initially by Operation Saturn, but due to the consumption of resources was brought down a little bit and became Little Saturn. So keep this part in mind. The overall plan for Mars. The idea was that 9th Army would basically be destroyed. It has a variety of corps, some of which are Panzer corps here. 41st Panzer Corps, and over here, 39th Panzer Corps. But the idea was to drive through the base of the salient and then extend down to Miasma. And then with that consolidated, more attacks could be launched toward Vitebsk and Smolensk. This operation required a great deal of planning, and it required great supervision. Much as credit is given, and some rightfully, to Zhukov for Uranus and even Little Saturn, he actually was not the immediate commander when those attacks went in. Zhukov was up here. So if you think about the importance of that particular general in most histories on the Eastern Front, why would you take what is considered to be the most important general you have and put him at his subsidiary operation? Doesn't make sense. So historically, the importance of Mars and the intent of Jupiter should be in our minds that this was intended to be a huge blow. And there's more information that supports that. The idea here, as you'll see, 700,000 personnel, nearly 2,000 tanks. That's not a trivial commitment. And in addition, armed forces were to raise that number even further. So if this is a relatively unimportant action, just a holding action of diversion, this doesn't make a great deal of sense. The attacks go in. And the important part is that as with most defensive operation by either side, you could have some initial success, but terrain, weather, logistical support, and the reactions of your enemy all play a role. It reminds me of a comment that was made to General Longstreet at the end of the American Civil War when he was asked why the South lost. And he said, I think the North had something to do with it. And it's a reflection, again, on how things balance out during the course of these kinds of military operations. The the Russian penetration here was to drive across, not to reach Vyazma yet, but to penetrate sufficiently that this grouping, which was considered even more powerful, would drive this way, not to here. The Luchesa River offensive was to help hold in place German units there. If it was possible, it would connect up and eventually cut off these two corps in the northern portion of this. But the main attempt was to get these two to link up. When the attacks went in, as I said, they were initially quite successful. And indeed, in one particular location that you'll see here around Belity, which isn't shown awfully well, the Russians actually had penetrated this deeply and had actually gone up towards this small town up here, nearly completely surrounding that town. Why did that matter? What was the importance? Why is it that the Russians were less successful? What happened is that the Germans held on to what are called the shoulders of the penetration. So think of it as putting your head through a narrow door. If the door only gets to let your head through, but your shoulders can't get through, you can't put the full force of your body into there and really force the door open and allow who's behind you to come through. And the Germans were particularly successful, again, sometimes on a shoestring, to hold the shoulders, particularly around this town and further south down here, on the western side of this salient. We're looking at the western portion here, the Kalen in front. and they're to drive in this direction. When they penetrated, they looked like their advanced units were really gonna make it. That they would get all the way down to here, and that this eastern penetration would come through and join them. But as with each of the penetrations, all the three that I showed you on the previous map, the Germans held the shoulders tightly and channeled the units into a narrower and narrower salient where their combat power was reduced. And eventually, by calling up reserves, they could drive through that salient that had now been created by the penetration and cut off the lead units. The other part to remember, this is now getting into the winter because we're talking about December and the weather is bad. And remember that in terms of technology, the Russians had tanks which were heavily armored, had more powerful guns, and had wider treads to navigate. But if you channel them into places where mobility is limited, even with those advantages, then you can destroy them. And you don't have to have necessarily bigger, more powerful guns to do it. And that's indeed what the Germans were able to accomplish, because at this stage of the war, the best German tank that could meet up against the Russians was either an upgunned Mark III, which was still relatively lightly armored and might have a 50mm gun on it, or an upgunned Mark IV, which had somewhat better armor, but again, a gun that was barely comparable to anything the Russians could produce. I mentioned here because this unit, this motorized brigade, had driven up and created a salient. But again, the Germans counterattack and cut it off. This gives you a little bit more of a broad picture what was happening over here. This is that movement of the motorized brigade here that I was showing you, looking as though they were going to take or encircle the town of Bellevue. The penetration here was stalled fairly quickly, and this was due to great command flexibility. The German staff still demonstrated operational flexibility and talent which the Russians could not match. This was partly based on better communications, but it was most seriously based on better training and doctrine. So von Arnim, for example, who later ended up in North Africa, actually allowed the commanders of a couple of these units to operate very independently. He didn't instruct them necessarily what to do. Basically says, when you see an opportunity to help close that shoulder or pinch it off, take it, and I'll find a way to support you. And that's a very different ethos from what many of the Russians were doing, where they get orders, attack here, attack here, attack here, do this, do that. Forget your flanks, don't pay attention. What was the outcome? Pretty enormous losses. Now, this isn't comparable to what we saw in the summer of 41, nor is it actually in some ways comparable to the losses from Stalingrad. But notice the time frame. You're talking 3 weeks. So in terms of losses on a day-to-day basis, you can begin to think that if you divide this by 20, you're talking 5,000 killed in a day, average. 10,000 a day wounded. Pretty extraordinary. It's interesting, therefore, and the reason I went into this time for this is because historians have neglected even barely mention. But in terms of operational importance, the reason for ignoring it is that they could say, listen, in terms of the overall Eastern Front, not a big deal. Now, this slide is just designed to show that by the time the Russians were going to organize their major offensive against the environs of Stalingrad, if you take into account all the units involved over the entire length of the front, not just what was happening in the city itself, then you're looking at a massive commitment. But notice, the Russian side, this is November 19th, has somewhat over 1 million. Operation Mars, in its first iteration, had almost 800,000. And then you consider the backstop if you're going to have Operation Jupiter to follow. So you begin to see that Operation Mars had comparable commitment. Your problems up there to run that. The important part of this too is to notice the proportion of Germans out of the total. Unlike what we saw in the opening operation in Barbarossa, June 41. Here, while the Germans are indeed still the majority, that is, the preponderance, yet they constitute about half of what is going to be involved in operations Uranus and then we'll just that. Okay, any questions at that point? The other thing I always like to point out, the Russians love archery. Now, you may not be familiar with this, but Kiwis are Ukrainians and Russians and other peoples who were unhappy with Stalin and his running of the government, who actually joined with the Germans. Oftentimes they were put in non-combat roles, supply, security, partisan operation, and they would try to hunt down partisans or so on. At the end of the war, some of these people, well, not in the end, in 44, some of these ended up on Normandy beaches. There's a scene that you may remember from one of the movies that basically, look, I'm Russian. I don't belong here. Don't shoot me. Okay. These guys were, of course, all going to be executed if they were ever turned back to Russia. And at the end of the war, a good many of them were. The Russians simply said, give us back our own people. And then they disappeared. Either to labor camps where they eventually died. Now, this sets the stage for the Battle of Stalingrad just before the offensive is launched. And the reason I show this, first, is that it gives you an idea of the scope that's involved here, which is really considerable. And if you look carefully, which you can't read nor can I, at the legend right down here, what it basically is showing you is the enormous length of this front line. That's why you have 1 million people there. Similarly, you'll notice that the 4th Romanian Army is here, the 3rd Romanian Army is here, and then you got the Italians here, and up further north, you're going to have the Hungarians. The point that I made earlier is that the Romanians, while they have numbers, lack equipment, particularly anti-tank guns of a great power that could stop the Russian tanks, and they had very little armor of their own. What armor they had of their own often was armor that had been taken from the French back in 1940. Or some Czech vehicles that had been taken when Czechoslovakia was there. And their training was much less profound, much less detailed, their doctrines much less well integrated, and they did not have any independent control over an air force. So they weren't in the same command structure that gave them the kind of flexibility to call upon air power to give them tactical support. You'll also see, if you look very closely at this map, that there are places where the Russians are across the Don River. And this represented a great threat because the Russians quite mysteriously, as far as the Germans were concerned, were crowding vehicles and men into these bridgeheads and getting ready to launch their attacks. And when they unfolded the following day, and you can see here in this map that Stalingrad looks almost done, not. The following strikes occurred. I show you Mars just to show what the intent had been. But here, Operation Uranus unfolds quickly. When this happens, it happens so quickly that at the time, it took only 5 days for the Russian forces to meet at the west end of the Don Bend at the town of Kalach, or however it's pronounced in my Russian is deficient. When that happens, and this again is just another way of demonstrating the effects. When that happens, the German Sixth Army is cut off in Stalingrad, and there are portions of the Fourth Panzer Army down here, which are trapped as well. The Romanians are basically wrecked. And while it appears that they're back here, their strength is nowhere near a Romanian army. They're fortunate if they're worth a corps. Similarly, the Fourth Romanian Army is pressed back badly as well. And this means that within a short period of time, as the Germans attempt to restore the front line that has now been terribly, terribly broken, as they try to restore that front line, the distance from which the German new front line is established to Stalingrad in just a few days is now 25 miles. Now this is getting to be wintertime as well. So in terms of 25 miles, here to just beyond the Rigo may not sound like a big distance, but wintertime and you're struggling just to hold on, and you've got the Don River between you and Stalingrad. You're gonna cross that in the face of Russian defenses. That's gonna be tough. So now critical decisions have to be made. And again, I like showing something because it gives you an idea of what actually is happening that we don't see when we're looking at a map. These guys are walking over enormous distances, carrying a light pack, if any, walking through snow, up over ridge lines. And they're making progress against the Romanians in particular, who are getting crushed. This just gives you another idea of some of the numbers that I was showing you before. Okay. Some idea of the complexity of the operation and the distances that are being covered. Down here, this is 25 miles, so roughly that distance from there to there. And the Romanians are being pushed back rapidly and have very little command structure with which to develop a defensive line. So the primary focus that Mike's has to consider in this situation is I have to restore that line. I have to block those Russian forces. I can't worry a whole lot about Sixth Army right now. But now, 5 days, all it took was for the Russians to encircle those troops. The Russians thought that they might have 100,000 Germans fought in Stalingrad. There were roughly between 250 and 300,000 that were caught there. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as we come further on in the lecture. This is just, again, a blow up of the map to just kind of show that when you have a bridgehead over the Don River, that blue line, You pack it full, and secretly, which the Russians were very good at this stage of the game, then you can blow through and begin to drive down, and there's Kalach down there. Okay? So it shows you the kind of penetration that occurs. Now, not all is going well for the Russians. They have a lot of breakdowns of their vehicles. Their supply lines get stretched out over bad terrain. There is not a good road network. But they're able to feed enough in, just as they had to hold Stalingrad, to keep pushing these forces forward. And to reach the operational limits they had hoped to reach, which would drive the Germans away and allow the encirclement of Sixth Army. This shows the drive from the south. Again, it's a blow up, but it shows how the Russians were able to press the Stalingrad defenders into a relatively small pocket. They relied greatly on Gumrak and Potomac airfields if they were to be supplied. And we'll come to that in just a moment. So now, if you look at this and you're the German senior officer in charge of that front Vice, your first obligation, I gotta stop this Russian offense. I have to hold it in place. I can't do anything yet about Sixth Army. If you're Hitler, you're thinking about this in a more strategic context. What do I tell Paulus, who's in charge of Sixth Army at this stage? You're just 5 days in. You think back on your experience from 41. What worked in 41? What worked was hold your ground, stay in place, fight them off, and eventually we will overcome this. Now, think that you're Paulus in charge of Sixth Army. This is my army. These are my men. We have been fighting for months successfully, but now suddenly we are surrounded. And it's winter. Winter is going to get worse. What can we do? Well, if I want to break out, if that's my intention, I have to develop a plan on the fly, which will get my units organized, fueled, and supplied in order to cross this gap, hopefully using these roads, but I have to get across this gap and I have to cross the downriver. And certainly with Russian units there, if I'm driving towards Kalach, and I'm a Russian, am I going to leave any bridge intact? Of course not. I'm going to blow it. So what do? I have to get my fuel together. I have to get my units organized. I have to get the vehicles all set up. I have to have a plan. I have to attack out. I have to have a rear guard that keeps the Russians who are in Stalingrad and the environs from pressing forward and destroying our operation. And in the midst of it, I'm going to be crossing open ground in winter with a river in front of me. The only way that's going to work is if the Germans on the west side of the town can drive across and help hold the bridgehead so I can get out. Do I have enough time to organize that? Do I even have the orders to do? And what's going to happen en route? So Paulus does some work and he looks to get from his senior commanders, how much fuel did they have? Well, it turns out, at least according to one historian, they all lied to him. They all said, gee, we don't have a lot of fuel. On the other hand, I'm keeping fuel so the vehicles I do have I can use to respond to the various attacks on my perimeter. So I can ship tanks and artillery and try to cover what's going on. So I can't tell Paulus I got a lot, or he's gonna usurp it all. I don't know what he's gonna do with it. So you have that issue, but you have consumed food and ammunition to a very high degree in this very heavy fighting in Stalingrad itself. So your units are nowhere near as intact as it might seem when you talk about having the Fifth Army Corps. Number of people alive and capable of fighting is fairly small. So you think your combat power may not be enough to get you out. And if you get partly out and you're caught in the open, you're destroyed very quickly. Now, if you're destroyed, then all of those units that were holding the perimeter against you are now free. And what will they do? Well, they're going to join the attackers. And in fact, as it turns out with the unfolding of Little Saturn, that's going to create a huge problem for the Germans. Because Little Saturn is going to follow on the heels of Uranus fairly quickly. Hitler tried to figure this out. Stand fast, work from 41. Okay, but I got this unit encircled, this army encircled at Stalingrad. What am I going to do about that? What do I have historically that helps me come to a decision? Well, it turns out in 41 and into the early part of 42, there was a 100,000 man concentration of German forces surrounded at a town called Donetsk. And Goering had been able to keep them supplied for several months during the winter by air transport. So Goering says to Hitler, we've done it before, I can do it here. And if we hold on, the Sixth Army holds on and is maintained, then when we build up enough forces to attack the Russians, we can break into Stalingrad and achieve an overland connection. And then we can decide where we go from there. Unfortunately, Goering totally either miscalculated or frankly lied. That part I'll leave to your own judgment. But when you look at the operational requirements for units in combat, and the German General Staff was absolutely aware of this, you could reckon on a certain amount of supplies you had to have in combat situations per day. So much food, so much ammunition, so much fuel, and so on. And when you look at how many units were trapped in Stalingrad, any computation you made just indicated the Germans were completely unable, under the best of circumstances, to get enough supplies in to keep them combat efficient. That meant every day that passed was a weakening of the defenders. Not just morally, because they're waiting and waiting and waiting to be relieved, but literally, physically, because they have fewer calories per day. And in the wintertime, you consume calories enormously in these kinds of situations. 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 calorie requirement a day is not unusual in winter in combat. But if you're only getting 1,500 calories a day, you're not just going to get thin, but you're going to get weak. On top of it, ammunition expenditure now has to be considered very, very carefully. How many rounds can that artillery piece fire in a day when you're under assault? You can't just throw a lot of shells out there anymore. You've got to be very, very careful. So, in this situation, Paulus is looking at the situation and says, I don't think I can break out, Weiss is saying, I gotta hold the perimeter just to keep the Russians from advancing further. And Goering is saying, I can supply. How hard is it for you to say, let's go with Goering? Now, similarly, the airfields that you have are very, very important. But this also gives you an idea. These are Russians. This guy got hit shortly after getting out. He didn't just trip and fall over the snow. And you could put a German in this same situation, trying to hold the perimeter, except that they're usually not trying to advance. And when this unfolds, Hitler finally says, all right, Stalingrad cannot be evacuated. I don't care, no matter what the historians are going to say about me, that just isn't going to happen. So even emotionally, he says, I'm hanging on to the city. But the second part is, he says, okay, I've got to muster some kind of relief, because even if Goering is correct, ultimately I have to relieve the city. So he brings down Manstein from up north. Because Manstein has been very successful in every job he's been given. And Manstein organizes a breakout called Operation Donnerschlag at one level, and I'm sorry, Operation Wintergewitter. Wintergewitter? Greg, is that correct?
Wintergewitter. W's are pronounced as B's.
All right. Wintergewitter. Operation Winter Storm. And at the same time, Paulus is supposed to break out as well. Now, Manstein is a very clever person, and while the proximity from the two closest points is 25 miles, he realizes the Russians are aware of that as he is. And they're going to be powerfully situated defensively to keep him from penetrating in that direction. But if he's further south, he doesn't have to worry about crossing the Don River, and he can drive up to Stalingrad from the south, and he might be able to penetrate into the city at that time. Now, operationally, again, like most things, despite the so-called imbalance of forces, the Germans make considerable gain. And indeed, at one point, they get close to, and by close, a little past the Wego from here, to where Paulus's army is caught. And Manstein tries very hard to get Paulus to break out. Paulus, again, in a way, pleads that I don't think I have the combat power to break out very far, and if I get out into this area, I'm likely to be destroyed. So you got to come to me. But more importantly, Hitler has said to Manstein, I'm not going to let Paulus go. You have to go to him. And if he comes south at all to join you, it is only for the purpose of creating a land corridor through which supplies can be funneled overland to Stalingrad. And eventually I'm looking to throw the Russians back once again and take the initiative. Well, the Russians were able to stop the Germans well short of reaching the perimeter. And as a result, soon after, Operation Little Saturn occurs. Little Saturn, the extension of Operation Uranus, which cut off Stalingrad in the beginning, is now another strategic move to destroy not just Army Group B, the one that was focused on Stalingrad, but to cut off Army Group A, which was down in the Caucasus. And the reason for that relates to this town down here and the Don River here, Rostov. Because if the Russians, who are closer to Rostov than much of Army Group A, which is off map to the south, if they get there first, Army Group A cannot get over the Dunham River. They're trapped. The only place for them to go is into the Kuban Peninsula here, which across the Straits of Kerch, which does not have a bridge, leads to the Crimea.
Right.
You take an entire army group and pack it into the Kuban. Can you supply it over the Straits of Kerch? Can you evacuate all your heavy equipment back into the Crimea? So if you lose Rostov, you might lose not just an army, but an army group. So Manstein's attack fails, but in the process, he's also used up some of his own heavy equipment. And while he has thrown the Russians back a bit, his foray to try to relieve Stalingrad is brief enough that it really has no major impact. And when Little Saturn folds, they are going to attack and they're going to crush the Italians in the process. And they're going to drive down, and this is their focus, right there. Extraordinarily dangerous. Hitler recognizes this, as does his senior staff, and they basically tell Army Group A, you better get out of there in a hurry. And that's what they do. Army Group A had essentially reached only Minsk. They had not cleared the eastern shore of the Black Sea. Rail lines were tenuous, supply lines were tenuous. They literally at points had run out of gas. And now everybody hightail it and get out of Dodge. So it's an extraordinary accomplishment that Army Group A was able to get out of this trap, almost literally by the skin of its teeth. If they had been caught, and if the Russians at this time were even thinking, what's the real sweetness that I might get? I might be able to drive the Germans back far enough that I can cut the Crimea off. So that means all the units in Crimea, all of Army Group A, they're now cut off and they're going to die. Because evacuation by sea is going to be very inefficient as well. And then when I have the Crimea, I can put airfields there and I can bomb Molesky. And I can wreck the German oil fields. They're the ones on which they rely. So this gives you an idea of the magnitude of what's going on at this particular time, and represents an enormous victory for the Russians and an enormous defeat for the Germans. Is this the turning point, which some people like to talk about? I'm not sure. I'll give you my feelings on that in the fall, so you have to wait. This gives you a little better idea of what was going on in the northern part, okay? And I do this just simply to show that in terms of targets and the kind of movements that are taking place, the Germans are going to counterattack at different times. You can't just be falling back all the time. But the Russians really have the initiative here. And the Southern Arm, similarly, as they drive away to try to get to Rostov before the Army Group A, which you see way down here, they're all headed this way, right? They're headed in that direction. You can see that the Russians are pretty close to cutting them off. This is a very close run race. I like this picture again because it shows some of the kinds of engagements that are involved. And again, we have to think to ourselves, what was it like for this guy coming from a small Russian village, one that maybe was overrun by the Germans and destroyed. He's back there trying to do what he can. I'm sorry, this one's a little bit out of sequence. I'm gonna conclude in the last few minutes for the collapse of Stalingrad. I won't get into the details of it, but it is fascinating reading and the struggles that go on from both sides. Though most of the literature you can find will be written from the German side. It shows that once the Potomac and Gumrak airfields were taken, the Sixth Army had nothing to do but die in place. Well, the Russians offered the opportunity to surrender, allegedly with the legal protections that the laws of war were supposed to grant them. When you reflect that as a prisoner of war on either side, your chances of getting home were almost nil. You could ask yourself, do I surrender or do I just fight to the end and see what happens? The Russians miscalculated how many Germans were trapped, which lengthened the period of time it took them to reduce the pocket entirely. It took them well over 2 months, which is an extraordinary thing when you think about how destitute the German resources were. But as the front collapsed and then escalated fairly quickly, especially once the 2 airfields fell, then the end was pretty obvious. At that particular moment, just at the end of January, Hitler made an interesting decision. He promoted Paulus, promoted the field marshal, knowing that no German field marshal had ever been captured by an enemy. What was the message?
Kill yourself.
Don't get captured.
Exactly. You commit suicide.
Mm.
Sort of like the Japanese ethos. You don't surrender. If necessary, commit suicide or lead a banzai charge or whatever. Paulus felt that really wasn't his task. So he surrendered his pocket, and the southern pocket was surrendered shortly after, as you can see. There are pockets that are formed here. And the third pocket surrendered about 2 to 3 days later. This gives you an idea of the losses. Now, compared to Operation Mars, Mars doesn't appear to be as bad, if you will, as these numbers. And of course, the numbers that we're dealing with are in some ways best guesses. So, but it gives you a rough idea of the range. But think about it from this perspective once again. American losses throughout the entirety of World War II, dead, about 400,000. So we're talking December 7th, 1941, to September, when the Japanese finally surrendered in 1945. 400,000. September to February. One portion of the Eastern Front. One portion. Russian losses. The emphasis that I put on the Eastern Front is largely driven by respect for what this represents, as well as to the critical importance the Eastern Front plays in the overall management and eventual outcome of World War II. This collapse was extraordinary. This gives you an idea, though, of what Hitler was saying by making the Russian armies that you see here committed to the reduction of Stalingrad, rather than try to have Paulus break out, get destroyed in the process, not be able to add much combat power to the defense, even if he makes it, and yet free up all these Russian units to join in the offense. Here's Paulus, you can see how thin this guy is at this point. And he eventually actually starts, in a sense, working for the Russians by providing propaganda that Hitler is basically evil and leading the country to destruction. The prisoners who were brought in, again, threadbare. Not because there hadn't been some thought about providing winter guard, but it couldn't be delivered under the circumstances in which the fighting was occurring up to the penetration into Stalingrad itself. And then once things are cut off, then those supplies of clothing are not going to arrive. Did he ever get home? Probably not. What about the wounded who didn't get out of Stalingrad? Dead, one way or another. Not necessarily executed, though a number would have been if they just said, listen, you're dying anyway, and I don't have the transport to take you back. I'm certainly not going to bother to feed you. And considering what you did to my family in my village in Ukraine or Belarus or wherever, why do you expect any mercy from me? How old do you think he is?
Oh my, what a picture.
He's not going to be home. And here they are. You don't have transport for these people. You're going to walk. It's winter. How are you going to be fed? What are you going to do when it's night? What are you going to do when the temperature drops to minus 20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit or centigrade? What is that going to be like for you eventually? So you see, I throw up different numbers of what's going on, but the point of this is that the destruction that takes place, not just physically, but within the city itself, is absolutely extraordinary. And this is just one part of the Eastern Front. One part over just a few months. And this shows you, this particular slide, how close run it was, because if Army Group A had not gotten out, and some did not, some were caught in the Kuban and eventually did get across the Kerch Straits. But if the Army had been caught here and the Russians did not have this holding them back, the Perekop Isthmus was opened. Here's the guy who did it. No, the grunt, the Russian soldier, the guy who was given an order to attack, bring his weapon with him, and hopefully achieve something great. Other things occurred as a result of this collapse, and that was that the Germans had to evacuate various salients in order to shorten the front line and create units which could be sent south to try to bolster the defense, which was on the verge of collapse. Not going into that here, though. Next time we'll talk about some of the battles around Kharkov yet again, third and fourth battles they're sometimes called. And how did the Germans manage, after these enormous losses, to maintain a front line? And by the middle of 1943, put together a powerful set of units to conduct an offense around a salient that had been created by the Russian advances, with the center of that salient named after a city. So, thank you for attending. I appreciate it very much.
What the hell is going on with this goddamn order?
And if you have any questions, again, comments, suggestions,
We-
criticisms, but only the mildest. Feel free to let me know.
A psychiatrist called Ivan Plus.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That's why. And he came back after the war. 5 years.
Yeah, the average was 5 years for any who got that, and sometimes.
Yeah, was he at Stalingrad? I forgot when I